Hey guys, Daniel here, and we have the second half of The Chosen, The Last Supper, Part 1. We've got flash forwards and flashbacks and one really angry Messiah. Can the show keep its momentum going after a very solid first episode? There's a ton going on in this one, so let's get into it. So after a really solid premiere episode, the season's second episode is arguably even more dynamic. Overall, I'm not sure that the second episode maintains the first sort of brisk pace and energy from start to finish, but it definitely has the more dramatic and I think emotionally rich scenes, and it's capped off with a really explosive climax. I'm not sure that everything works this week, but the stuff that does works really well. So let's sort of walk through this. So once again, the episode begins with a flash forward to the Last Supper, opening with the very penetrating question from Jesus, "Will you lay down your life for me?" I think it's another gripping opening that immediately infuses the episode with a sense of urgency and stakes. I'm not sure how long these sort of cold open flash forwards will be able to maintain their potency before they start to feel overdone. But at least so far, it's just proven to be a really inspired creative decision. And actors Jonathan Rumi and Shahar Isaac really shine in this opening encounter. Isaac's portrayal as Peter has always exuded winsome charisma, which has frequently been used for levity, as is the case later in this episode. But he gives a very earnest and heartfelt performance here. And to me, the opening interaction between Peter and Jesus is just a showcase of The Chosen at its very best. And at least in my own experience within the church, the narrative of Peter declaring his loyalty to Jesus and his willingness to follow him even unto death is often framed almost comically as boastful Peter, the brash and bumbling disciple who talks a big game like some sort of armchair quarterback. But The Chosen gives much more emotional energy and intensity to the exchange, because Peter's hurt at Jesus's apparent doubt at his commitment, and then Jesus's own sorrow and hurt for the eventual betrayal are just unmistakable. And it's such a moving and I think well-acted moment that one can only imagine how heart-wrenching the eventual fallout will be. And the opening sequence then ends with a very vivid summation of the gospel, where Jesus says, "Greater love has no one than this, than someone lay down his life for his friends." When Peter replies, "Then that's what we'll do," Jesus corrects him, "That is what I will do," which is just a perfect start to the episode. And the flash forward opening is then followed by a flash back to a scene set just prior to the disciple Thomas's departure to the site of Jesus's first miracle. And it's a decision that I think makes narrative and even thematic sense, but I do think it is a little bit cumbersome to begin the episode with two different tone-setting non-linear scenes. And I'm not sure the second scene is totally necessary, as it mostly serves as just a reminder of the better days between Thomas and Rama's parents. At the same time, it does provide, I think, an effective backdrop for some very excellent moments later in the episode. One small detail that I did really like is the transition back to the main timeline, which is a brief shot of a field of wheat and a scene cut that is almost jarringly abrupt and interrupts a tender moment between Rama's parents before it feels fully finished. And it's just a powerful tie-in to Jesus' sermon last episode about losing one's life to find it. And I think it's the type of subtle visual storytelling that elevates something like The Chosen to a higher standard than many of the other faith-based stories. And actor Joey Bahadi gives a very moving performance as Thomas in this episode. One of the strengths I think of the show thus far has been to humanize the disciples. As I mentioned last review, sort of the doubting Thomas Monkier has always felt a little bit unfair, basically defining the historical disciples' entire identity by a singular moment. And the show has gone to great lengths just to add nuance to that eventual moment. And yes, it could be argued that the show's introduction of entire invented storylines and characters to add drama that explains that one defining moment is a bit excessive, kind of akin to Star Wars creating a whole prequel movie just to explain the existence of the exhaust port weakness in the Death Star. But the internal conflict of his character does feel very earned and believable. The Bible may not provide a backstory, but obviously there was a backstory and more going on in his journey than just what we read in scripture. And I think the interactions between Thomas and Rami's parents are some of the best moments of this episode, with the encounter between him and her mother being particularly tragic and I think well acted. But it's not all serious and tragic this week. Kind of after demonstrating dramatic range at the start of the episode, Peter also provides, I think, the episode's most humorous scene with his sermon gone wrong. I think it's a really hilarious moment, but I also think it's an important one because Bible readers know that Peter is not far removed from preaching one of the most impactful sermons ever preached. And so I think kind of showing his bumbling first attempts at preaching will pay off in future seasons when contrasted with the power in which he preaches the gospel when filled with the Holy Spirit. And Andrew's enthusiastic brotherly support and encouragement that he's never been more proud is one of this episode's most heartwarming moments. I think the relational dynamic between the two brothers is one of the best in the show, and this may be one of their best moments together. But let's not bury the lead here, because what really takes, I think, this mostly solid episode to a higher level is its very explosive climax, which was foreshadowed last week. Because after being central to the opening episode, Jesus is largely absent in this one, but his eventual appearance does result in one of the show's most dramatic moments. It's interesting too because the cleansing of the temple biblical narrative has become a popular proof text by Christians in recent years to justify demonstrations of anger. If Jesus got mad, then so can I. So I was curious sort of how the show would approach that moment, especially because many other cinematic depictions have presented it more as a knee-jerk, reactionary moment. For example, the Last Supper film released earlier this month, the moment comes off almost as an emotional tantrum from Jesus as he loses control of himself. And thankfully, at least to me, The Chosen takes a much more, I think, level approach. I think by building towards the moment at the end of last episode, the scene plays out as being deliberate and intentional from Jesus rather than a spontaneous reaction to his circumstances. Now, biblically, kind of given the brevity of the Gospels, there are no details about the lead up to the outburst. So The Chosen is sort of filling in some gaps here, but I think their interpretation does feel true to the character of Christ, where even in anger, Jesus is still in full control. And while it does take a more measured approach, the show also doesn't hold back for the scene itself, where the wrath of Jesus is fully unleashed. And I think Jonathan Rumi is able to capture sort of that righteous anger barely kept at bay. And the scene is, I think, intentionally uncomfortable to watch. And I think the choice to introduce a generous bird vendor earlier in the episode and then have Jesus turn his wrath upon him as well only adds to the unease. The Chosen has always kind of been primarily told from the perspective of the disciples, and that appears to, I think, be the case in this scene as well. As the audience shares in the disciples' shock at the unexpected and seemingly out of character moment, and Jesus standing before the crowd wielding a whip as vendor tents aflame in the background, staring down the religious leaders, may be one of the most cinematic and memorable shots of the entire series. And before we wrap this up, again, had just a few miscellaneous thoughts and observations on the episode. First, I like the exchange in the temple market where a disciple says, "These are sacred grounds," and the moneylender responds, "Yes, and you're holding up the line." I just thought that was some real crisp dialogue that really succinctly conveys the entire situation at the temple market. Second, I think somebody better go get Jesus a fedora because he would give Indiana Jones a run for his money with his whip skills. I will admit that I did find it maybe slightly over the top and a little bit silly, but Jesus whipping the table leg to bring it down was still a pretty epic boss move by him. Finally, kind of conveying the exposition of the Passover and Jewish customs has always been a little tricky in adaptations like this. The Chosen often approaches this problem by simply having a Jewish character explain the customs to Gentiles, or at least to less informed Jews, and it does work, but it still is a little bit clunky. And I do wonder if there are other more creative ways to convey that expositional information without always just resorting to a verbal lecture. But overall, I think this is another really good episode that should satisfy fans of the show. Kind of with the end of part one, the tables have turned, and not just the ones overturned in the temple market, because with Jesus unleashing his fury, it does feel like the game has changed, as captured in Judas's sort of closing bewildered statement, "What have you done?" And with that, The Chosen is back in full swing, I think setting up what is sure to be a very dramatic part 2. But hey, I would love to hear what you guys thought, so don't be shy, jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation about it. Encourage you guys too, if you haven't done so, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider, got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide with your world for Christ.